slavery, pirates, revolution, and 3 centuries of British sailors receiving alcohol as part of their government pay. This isn't an adventure novel. It's the story of one drink. On July 31st, 1970, the Royal Navy abolished the sailors' daily rum ration. The tradition had lasted for 315 years. That day, sailors cried. Some even held an official funeral for their daily tot, with a coffin, black armbands, and a minute of silence. To this day, the Royal Navy remembers it as Black Tot Day. For more than 3 centuries, the government had paid its sailors partly in alcohol, and when that payment disappeared, they mourned it as if they had lost a person. But that was only the ending of one story. Rum was the literal currency of the Atlantic triangular trade, exchanged for enslaved people on the West African coast. The American Revolution wasn't sparked only by tea. It was also fueled by taxes on molasses, the very ingredient the colonies used to make rum. The pirates of the Caribbean didn't drink rum because they loved adventure. They drank it because it was often cheaper than fresh water and far less likely to make them sick. And today, one of the world's best-selling rums is made using the recipe of a Cuban family that Fidel Castro forced into exile in 1960. They still produce it in the Bahamas while continuing to call it Cuban. How did one drink end up at the center of slavery, revolution, piracy, and the Cold War at the same time? And what does that tell us about how power really works when no one can see it?
The 1620s, Barbados. British colonists had just established the island's first sugarcane plantations. Sugarcane thrived here thanks to the tropical climate, fertile volcanic soil, and abundant rainfall. The problem was that sugar production was a messy and wasteful process. After the cane was crushed and the syrup boiled down until it crystallized, a thick, dark liquid remained, molasses. No one knew what to do with it. It was poured into ditches, fed to livestock, or dumped into the sea. The enslaved people working on the plantations noticed something interesting. When molasses was mixed with water and left in the sun, it began to ferment. It became alcoholic. You could drink it. None of the plantation owners took it seriously. Molasses was considered waste, and the enslaved workers could do whatever they wanted with something that had already been thrown away. Then someone, whose name history never recorded, which says a great deal in itself, had an idea. They distilled the fermented molasses, just as wine was distilled in Europe. What came out was harsh, fiery, and incredibly strong. Early records referred to it by different names: Kill Devil, Rum Bullion. Eventually, the name was shortened to rum. The first written reference to rum dates to 1620 in Barbados. It was hardly flattering. The author described it as a hot, hellish, and terrible liquor. Even so, by the 1650s, rum production on Barbados had already become an industry. Because plantation owners quickly realized one thing: rum could be made from waste they had once thrown away. The production cost was almost nothing. The profits were enormous. Cheap rum needed a market, and it found one. But that market turned out to be far darker than anyone could have imagined in the beginning. By the end of the 17th century, a system historians now call the triangular trade had taken shape. Ships from New England carried rum to West Africa. In Africa, rum was exchanged for people, captured in war or sold by local rulers. Those people were then transported across the Atlantic to the plantations of the Caribbean and the American South. There, they labored to produce sugar and molasses. The molasses was shipped back to New England to make more rum. The circle was complete. Rum was the literal currency of this system, not metaphorically, literally. West African rulers accepted rum as payment for human beings.
Slave traders kept barrels of rum aboard their ships as working capital, much like businesses hold dollars today. The price of a person was measured in gallons of rum. This is not an exaggeration for dramatic effect. It is what surviving trade records from the 17th and 18th centuries actually show. Rum produced in New England, especially in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, financed a significant portion of the Atlantic slave trade. The distilleries of Boston and Providence were built on that commerce. Much of the wealth that later became the foundation of America's Industrial Revolution can be traced back to rum money. It is an uncomfortable truth that American history preferred not to emphasize for a very long time.
By the middle of the 18th century, the system operated like clockwork, brutal, precise, and invisible to anyone far enough removed from its machinery. A ship left Newport or Boston with its hold packed full of barrels of rum. It crossed the Atlantic. In the Gulf of Guinea or along the coast of Senegal, the captain met with local intermediaries, chiefs or Arab merchants, and negotiations began. The price of one person could range from 10 to 100 gallons of rum, depending on age, sex, and physical condition. It was recorded in the trade ledgers with the same precision a modern accountant records business expenses. The average Atlantic crossing took 6 to 8 weeks. Between 10 and 20% of the people being transported died before reaching the other side. Their bodies were thrown overboard. On the plantations of Barbados, Jamaica, or Virginia, the survivors were sold to sugar planters. The planters paid in sugar and molasses. The molasses was shipped to the distilleries of New England. Rum was produced. The ship was loaded once again. Rum produced in New England, especially in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, financed a significant portion of the Atlantic slave trade. The distilleries of Boston and Providence were literally built on that trade. Much of the wealth that later became the foundation of America's Industrial Revolution can be traced back to rum money. It is an uncomfortable truth that American history preferred not to emphasize for a very long time. By the middle of the 18th century, Massachusetts alone was home to more than 150 rum distilleries. Rum had become the colony's largest manufactured product, and it was this very fact that led to an event that changed the course of American history, just not in the way most people think.
1764, the British Parliament passed the Molasses Act, imposing a tax on molasses imported into the American colonies from non-British Caribbean islands. For the colonists, it was a direct blow to the heart of their economy. French and Dutch molasses was cheaper than its British counterpart, and it was exactly what American distilleries relied on. The new tax made rum significantly more expensive. The colonists were furious, not because they were idealistic champions of liberty, but because their livelihoods were under threat. Rum merchants, distillers, and tavern owners all faced the prospect of financial ruin. The boycott of British goods that followed the Molasses Act became the first organized political action taken by the American colonies against the British Crown. John Adams, the future second president of the United States, later wrote that it was the taxes on molasses and rum that laid the foundation of American independence. The tea tax that everyone learns about in school came later. The Boston Tea Party of 1773 was the climax, but it was rum that lit the fuse. Rum inspired the first organized economic protest, the first committees of correspondence between the colonies, and the first real experience of collective resistance against London. When the Revolution began and George Washington's Continental Army took the field, another reality quickly became apparent. The soldiers demanded rum as part of their daily ration.
Washington wrote to Congress several times, warning that the Army could not remain effective without a steady supply of rum. Congress took those requests seriously. Rum was not a luxury, it was part of the infrastructure of war. The revolution that gave birth to what would become the world's largest democracy began as an economic protest by producers of alcohol. History sometimes begins that way. And while the colonists were fighting for the right to make rum without British taxes, another war was unfolding across the Caribbean. It was far older, far more romanticized, and far more directly connected to rum than any revolution.
While revolution was brewing on the mainland, another story was unfolding across the Caribbean, shorter, bloodier, and far more romanticized by later generations. The golden age of piracy, roughly from 1680 to 1730, coincided with the rise of rum production in the Caribbean for a reason. Pirates drank rum for the same reason every other sailor did. Water stored in barrels spoiled within a few weeks. Beer turned sour. Rum neither spoiled nor cost much. The difference was that pirates drank far more of it than any navy would have allowed. They had no official ration to follow. Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, appears, according to historical sources, to have possessed an extraordinary sense of theater. Before battle, he wove slow-burning fuses into his beard, making his face emerge through the smoke like something out of a nightmare. His contemporaries described him as the devil himself. Yet most historians today believe that Teach captured ships more through intimidation than actual violence. His reputation was so terrifying that many captains surrendered without a fight. A good reputation saves gunpowder. Teach was killed in 1718. British naval officer Lieutenant Maynard caught up with him off the coast of North Carolina. According to eyewitness accounts, Teach suffered 5 gunshot wounds and around 20 sword cuts before finally collapsing. His head was cut off and hung from the ship's bowsprit as proof for the colonial authorities. That is not dramatic embellishment. It is a documented historical fact recorded in official reports. But the stranger story linking rum to the British Royal Navy is not about a pirate, it's about an admiral. And it explains why when the daily rum ration was finally abolished more than 250 years after Blackbeard's death, hardened sailors wept. Horatio Nelson, the greatest naval commander in British history, was killed at the Battle of Trafalgar on October 21, 1805. A French sharpshooter struck him in the shoulder aboard his flagship, HMS Victory. Nelson survived for another 3 hours, long enough to learn that his fleet had won, before dying from blood loss. His body had to be transported to London for a state funeral. The journey from Cape Trafalgar to Portsmouth took several weeks. In the warm climate, the body would not have survived the voyage. The ship's surgeon made a decision that was both practical and deeply unsettling. Nelson's body was placed inside a large cask of brandy. The Royal Navy happened to have brandy on hand rather than rum, although the legend insists it was rum. And that is how it made the journey home. When Victory arrived in Portsmouth and the cask was finally opened, the naval officers discovered that it was almost empty. The brandy had evaporated through the pores of the wood during the weeks at sea. Or, according to another version of the story, one the Royal Navy never officially denied, the sailors drilled a small hole into the bottom of the cask and drank from it throughout the voyage. To this day, dark Caribbean rum is sometimes called Nelson's blood. No one knows for certain whether the story is true or merely a legend, but it reveals something important about the relationship British sailors had with their daily ration of rum. A navy that preserved its admirals in alcohol while issuing it to sailors every single day for 3 centuries was not the product of chance or drunkenness, it was government policy. And when that policy finally came to an end, the reaction was exactly what you would expect.
Now, let's return to July 31st, 1970, the day where our story began. The tradition of the Royal Navy's daily rum ration dates back to 1655, when Admiral William Penn captured Jamaica and discovered that the island had little to offer the fleet as payment except its stores of rum.
The ration replaced beer, which could not survive the tropical climate. From that moment on, every day at noon aboard British warships, the order rang out, "Up spirits." The sailors formed a line. The boatswain measured out the standard ration for each man, at first a full pint, then gradually reduced over the centuries until it had shrunk to just 8 milliliters by the 20th century. 3 centuries without a single interruption. By 1970, naval technology had advanced to the point where the Admiralty reached an obvious conclusion. The men operating nuclear reactors and modern weapon systems should not be doing so under the influence of alcohol. The logic was flawless. The fleet's reaction was genuine grief. On Black Tot Day, sailors gathered on the decks of Royal Navy ships around the world. They drank the final ration in silence. Some poured it into the sea as a gesture of mourning. On several ships, symbolic funerals were held, complete with a coffin and a flag. A tradition that had outlived Napoleon, 2 world wars, and the fall of the British Empire died in peacetime at the hands of common sense. Today, only one exception remains in the Royal Navy. The monarch can still order a rum ration to be issued on special occasions. Queen Elizabeth II exercised that privilege several times. The tradition is dead, but not entirely. In 1920, the United States introduced Prohibition. The production and sale of alcohol were banned, and once again, rum played a role that no lawmaker had ever intended. The Caribbean islands lay beyond American jurisdiction. In Bahamas, Cuba, and Jamaica, rum was produced legally and in enormous quantities. Nassau is only about 300 kilometers from the coast of Florida. A fast boat could make the crossing overnight. Rum runners became some of the wealthiest people in Prohibition-era America. They invested in faster boats, wooden speedboats capable of reaching 30 knots and outrunning the Coast Guard under the cover of darkness. They invested in bribing officials. They built warehouse networks stretching from Miami to Boston. William McCoy, one of the most famous rum runners, became legendary for the quality of his liquor and his honesty in business. His reputation was so strong that his name became an expression. The real McCoy came to mean something genuine, authentic, and unadulterated. The phrase is still used today, and most people have no idea that it traces its origins back to a rum smuggler.
The organized crime syndicates that grew out of the rum-running business included men who would go on to dominate the American underworld for decades after Prohibition ended. Al Capone himself got his start in the illegal alcohol trade. The fortunes made during Prohibition became the financial foundation of criminal organizations that survived for another half-century. But there's an unexpected twist to this story, one that explains why rum is associated today with Caribbean vacations rather than smoky dockside taverns. It was Prohibition that made rum popular among the American middle class. Before the ban, rum was considered a drink of the working class. Respectable people drank whiskey or gin. During Prohibition, smuggled Caribbean rum became the backbone of cocktail culture. It was mixed with fruit juice, sugar, and ice to soften its harsh taste. The daiquiri, the mojito, the piña colada, all of the cocktails that now feel like timeless vacation classics grew out of attempts to make smuggled liquor more enjoyable to drink. The law was meant to destroy alcohol. Instead, it created cocktail culture and unintentionally rehabilitated a drink that had long been considered cheap and ordinary. It is perhaps one of the clearest examples of unintended consequences in the history of American legislation. And that unexpected rehabilitation opened the door to the next chapter, the story of a family that turned rum into a symbol of luxury, only to lose everything in a single day. And finally, the story that brings everything together. The Bacardi family founded their rum company in Cuba in 1862. Facundo Bacardi Massó was a Catalan immigrant who purchased a small distillery in Santiago de Cuba.
and after years of experimentation, developed a smoother, cleaner style of rum by filtering it through charcoal and using carefully selected yeast strains. The result was fundamentally different from the harsh Caribbean rums of the time. It was smooth enough to drink neat. Over the next 100 years, Bacardi became the largest rum brand in the world. Its headquarters were in Havana. Its production was in Cuba. Everything about it was Cuban. In 1960, Fidel Castro nationalized private businesses. The Bacardi family received official notice that their distilleries, equipment, warehouses, and trademarks now belonged to the Cuban state. No compensation was offered. But the family had already prepared. They had distrusted the revolution from the very beginning and quietly removed the most valuable assets from the island long before. Not money, not equipment. They took the proprietary yeast strains that had been used in production since 1862. The original recipes, their master blenders, key technicians, and production experts. All of it left Cuba before Castro closed the door on private capital. The family first relocated to the Bahamas, then established production in Puerto Rico. In time, the company's headquarters moved to Bermuda. Bacardi continued to exist and continued to be sold around the world, just no longer from Cuba.
After confiscating the distilleries, the Cuban government began producing its own rum, at first under the old brand names until the courts put a stop to it, and later under a new one, Havana Club, in partnership with the French company Pernod Ricard. Today, it is one of the best-selling rum brands in the world, everywhere except the United States, where the embargo against Cuba remains in effect. Bacardi, meanwhile, registered the Havana Club trademark in the United States, preventing anyone else from selling rum under that name on the American market. The legal battle between Bacardi and Havana Club over the brand name has now lasted for more than 30 years, making it one of the longest-running trademark disputes in American legal history. The family that was driven off the island in 1960 is still fighting in court for the rights to a Cuban name. The Cold War has long since ended. That dispute has not. So what does all of this mean? Why has the history of a single drink found itself time and again at the center of some of the most important events of the past several centuries?
Rum began as a waste product. Molasses was poured into ditches because there was simply nowhere else to put it. No one intended to turn it into anything valuable. The enslaved people who first began distilling it had no claim to what they created. That detail matters. Yet this waste product became the currency used to buy and sell human beings. It became the fuel of the revolution that gave birth to what would become the world's largest democracy. It became the daily ration that kept history's greatest navy operational for 3 centuries. It became the tool of smugglers who, in trying to disguise the taste of illegal alcohol, accidentally created cocktail culture. And it became the subject of a trademark dispute that has outlived the Cold War and continues to this day. But the most important thing the history of rum tells us is not about the drink itself. It is about the invisibility of power. The triangular trade depended on rum, yet millions of people buying it in the dockside taverns of Boston had no idea they were helping finance the slave trade. They believed they were simply buying a drink. British sailors who lined up every day for their ration never thought that the state was using alcohol as an instrument of loyalty. They believed they were receiving a well-earned reward. Americans who drank rum in speakeasies during the 1920s never imagined that their money was flowing into the pockets of the men who would later become the architects of organized crime. They believed they were resisting an unjust law.
We always think we understand what we're buying. We believe we're buying flavor, we're buying a feeling, we're buying a tradition, or a rebellion against one. But every purchase is part of a system we rarely see and almost never stop to think about. The history of rum is a mirror that reveals how that system works, how waste becomes value, how value becomes an instrument of control,
how an instrument of control becomes a symbol of freedom, and how a symbol of freedom ultimately becomes the subject of a legal battle between Cuban exiles and a French corporation in American courts. Barbados, the 1620s. The enslaved people who first began distilling molasses received nothing for what they created. No money, no freedom, not even their names in the historical record. The creators of the drink that would shape the course of several centuries remained anonymous. That too is part of the lesson: who receives the rewards for what others create, and why it matters to remember that the next time you open a bottle. Perhaps that is the most honest lesson a drink made from something once thrown away can teach us, and also the most uncomfortable, because it is not really about the past, it is about every choice we make without thinking about the system that choice belongs to. Rum simply makes that system visible if you are willing to look closely enough and long enough. Not bad for a liquid made from waste once thrown into ditches of Barbados 400 years ago, and from the labor of people whose names history never preserved.